Okay, so have you ever, like, really stopped to think about how much emphasis there is these days on, like, saying the asterisk, right? Asterisk
Oh,
thing?
yeah.
It's, like,
Well,
crazy.
it's like we're all supposed to be following this, like, invisible rule book for communication that no one ever actually gave us, you know?
Right. And it's already, like, tricky enough for anyone, but imagine how much more complex it can be for autistic individuals.
Absolutely. It's like what we consider common sense in social situations. That's not always so common for everyone.
Exactly. And that is what we are diving into today. We've got this really interesting article. Oversharing is not trauma dumping, a perspective for autistic individuals.
Mm.
And I always get a little curious when people start throwing around labels.
Right.
So we're going to unpack what oversharing and trauma dumping actually mean, especially in this context.
Yeah. And I think what's even more important is, like, why those terms in particular might not always be the most accurate way to describe what's actually happening when an autistic person is sharing, more personal information.
Right, because their intent might be totally different.
Exactly.
So to start us off, can you just walk us through how oversharing and trauma dumping are, I guess, like typically defined?
Yeah. So, I mean, both of them, at the end of the day, they involve sharing personal information.
Okay.
Often, things that are maybe more on the sensitive side. But I think with oversharing, it's usually more unintentional.
Okay.
Like think about, I don't know, telling a coworker about a really weird dream you had.
Yeah,
It's like maybe a little too much information there.
a little too much. Okay. So then, is trauma dumping more intentional?
It can be.
Yeah.
It's definitely more about like unloading emotional baggage onto someone, and often without really considering if they're in a place to really hear it.
Right, right.
Like imagine someone just launching into a really detailed account of a past trauma at like a dinner party.
Yeah.
Probably not the time or place.
Yeah. That's going to change the vibe real quick.
Exactly.
So it sounds like the impact on the listener and the motivation of the sharer are kind of key here.
Yeah,
But as this article points out, things get a lot more nuanced when we're talking about autistic individuals.
absolutely. And that's what the article really tries to highlight, right? Like how an autistic individual might be sharing personal experiences for very different reasons,
Hmm.
and how that can be, kind of easily misconstrued as oversharing or even trauma dumping when it's coming from, a completely different place.
Okay, so give us the details. What are some of those reasons?
Well, I think a big one that the article talks about is differing social cues. Oftentimes autistic individuals might not pick up on those sort of subtle hints that someone's uncomfortable.
Like what? Like if they keep looking at their watch while you're telling a story.
Exactly. Or they're like trying to subtly change the subject.
Okay, yeah.
Those kinds of cues, they may not register the same way. And so what seems like too much information to one person is really just an autistic person trying to connect authentically.
Wow, that's a really good point. It's like they're working with a totally different social playbook.
Right.
What else? What else does this article talk about?
This is a really interesting one. The article also talks about how some autistic individuals, they just process emotions differently, right?
Mhm.
So for some, verbalizing those feelings, even if they, seem intense or whatever, that can be a way of actually regulating those emotions.
Oh,
Like that's how they process.
yeah, it's not like they're trying to dump it on someone. They're trying to understand it themselves.
Exactly. It's about, understanding themselves better, not necessarily, burdening someone else.
Right.
It's not about dumping trauma. It's about trying to make sense of kind of their inner experience.
So we've talked about like the social cues thing and then also how like people process emotions differently. Is there another reason the article mentions why this kind of sharing might happen that's specific to, you know, people on the spectrum?
Yeah, absolutely. You're totally on the right track with that. The article also talks about this desire for like understanding.
Okay.
And I think if you think about it, it makes sense, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Because autistic individuals, a lot of times they're navigating a world that doesn't really truly understand their experiences.
Right.
So sharing those experiences, even the ones that might seem like, whoa, that's a lot. To others, that can be their way of like building a bridge to connection.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is my reality. I want you to try to see it. Yes, exactly. And I think, it's really important to think about it as an invitation to empathy, not a burden.
Right.
And it actually makes me think about something that you said earlier about how there's this like pressure to say the right thing.
Yeah.
What if sometimes the right thing is simply like listening with an open mind? even when someone's experience is really different from our own.
I love that shift in perspective, but I also keep thinking about the listener, right?
For sure.
Because even with like the best of intentions, sometimes hearing those really personal things can feel kind of overwhelming, regardless of who is sharing. So how do we kind of balance understanding the autistic perspective with also making sure everyone feels comfortable in these conversations?
Totally. And that's where this article gets like really practical, which I appreciate.
Okay.
It gives some like really solid tips, not just for autistic individuals, but really for anyone who's navigating these kinds of like potentially sensitive conversations.
Okay, let's hear them. What's the first tip?
Knowing your audience,
Yeah.
which, I mean, it seems obvious, but I think we've all been there, where we get like caught up in a moment and maybe we overshare something that's like not quite right for the context.
Like telling your dentist about your latest dating app drama when
Yeah.
they're, trying to check your molars or something.
Exactly, 100%. So this article stresses, like really thinking about who are you talking to? What's your relationship with them? And what might they be prepared to hear in that moment? What you would share with your best friend is probably very different from what you'd share with, just someone you casually know.
Right, for sure. Okay, what else?
Asking permission. Before you just like launch into the heavier stuff, it can be really helpful to just do a quick, hey, is it okay if I share something kind of personal right now?
Oh, I love
It
that.
just like creates that space for consent and mutual respect.
Yeah.
And then finally, the article emphasizes being mindful of just like the overall context of the situation.
Right.
Like, a work meeting. Probably not the best place to unpack all of your deepest fears and anxieties.
No, definitely not the time for an existential crisis in the middle of a PowerPoint presentation.
Yeah.
And you know what? On that note, it's okay for anyone, autistic or not, to set boundaries too, right?
100%.
Like if someone is sharing something that feels like a little too much, you can politely excuse yourself or just gently steer the conversation in a different direction. That is totally valid.
Yes. Setting and respecting those boundaries is so crucial. And sometimes that might mean like literally saying something like, hey, I'm really glad that you feel comfortable like sharing this with me, but I'm not sure that I'm the best person to give you the support that you might need right now.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
This has been so eye-opening, but I feel like this is bigger than just like individual interactions. You know what I mean?
Right.
It feels like it's about something much bigger.
It speaks to this larger need that we have for like a more inclusive and understanding society, right? One where these differences in communication, they're just seen as that.
Yeah.
Differences, not deficits.
Yeah. And where, autistic individuals can feel safe to express themselves authentically without being, labeled or misunderstood.
Exactly. We need to move away from this like judging and labeling and move towards more curiosity and understanding.
Right.
Like being curious about other people's experiences.
Yeah. I love that. It's like we're all speaking different languages sometimes, even when we're using the same words, And this article really highlights how important it is to be mindful of those different languages, especially when it comes to like neurodiversity and interacting with people on the spectrum.
Yeah, it's so true. It's about recognizing that connection and understanding can look really different for someone on the autism spectrum and their way of communicating, even if it doesn't necessarily fit our like preconceived notions, might actually be their way of reading out, of trying to build a bridge.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's like the biggest takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with? What's that one thing they can carry with them?
I think next time you hear yourself thinking, wow, that's a lot of information, or why are they telling me this? Especially if you're interacting with someone who's autistic,
Yeah.
just try to like hit the pause button on that judgment.
Ooh, I love that. Hit the pause button. Like take a breath.
Just like take a moment.
Check in.
Exactly.
And be like, what if this is actually an opportunity for me to learn something new? What if, instead of labeling it, I try to understand where this person is coming from?
Yes, 100%. Because what we might initially perceive as oversharing
Yeah.
could actually be a really deeply personal invitation to connect on a more authentic level. And, at the end of the day, isn't that what we all crave? Connection, understanding.
It really is. Such great food for thought for everyone listening. Thank you so much for diving into this with me. It's been a really, really eye-opening conversation.
Oh, absolutely. Thank asterisk you, asterisk. This is great.